Welcome, scholars! We're now into Unit 6, Section 3. This lesson is titled Indian Ocean Trade. We're really going to be getting into trade and exploration in this unit, but to lay the groundworks for that, I want to spend today's lesson going back over some of the main points that are going to be driving the expansion of trade and the age of exploration. And that all has its roots in the Indian Ocean Trade Network. So let's take a look. It begins by once again looking at the Silk Road, okay, the land routes and the sea routes that exchanged goods between the East and the West. Now, throughout by the 15th century, the 1400s, we see very well developed trade routes between Asia and Europe and Africa. All these continents are connected well, particularly East Africa, less so West Africa, through this international trade network. Now, the Indian Ocean is carrying a lot of that. That is this ocean that sits right below Europe and alongside Africa. This Indian Ocean, of which the Indian subcontinent projects into, is already important in the transfer of these goods, but is just going to become more and more important. Being located as it is, with good contacts already between Asia and Africa and up through the Red Sea into the Mediterranean area, this is going to be a very natural place for trade to develop and expand. Now, throughout the region, we see very important port cities developing. This is going to be a place where merchants from several nationalities are going to gather and learn about each other's goods and make their purchases and their transfers. I want to highlight for just a moment Calicut right here, because Calicut's going to come back into our story a couple of times, and it is located right here in India toward the southern part of that peninsula. This is going to be where the Arabian Sea trade meets trade coming from China. So that is where that is located. Just, remember that one if you can. Now, within these trading port cities and at a few other locations, we start to see the development of trading posts called entrepot. At an entrepot, you start to see the specialized storing of goods. Nations are going to develop just ports and warehouses, and they're going to store huge quantities of goods in these entrepot until it's the right time to sell them. You don't want to sell when the prices are too low. You want to wait for those prices to rise up a bit. And then you empty out your warehouses, and your entrepot are going to allow you to do that. So that's the root of the Indian Ocean trade and what's going on there. Let's take a look back at some of the main actors in the Silk Road trade, particularly in how it develops in the Indian Ocean. And we're going to start with the Mongols. Everything comes back to the Mongols. It's amazing. These people had an incredibly important influence on world history. And it's because of this expansion of trade that we've gone back to a few times now, that the Mongols are going to help drive this age of exploration. Trade expanded tremendously when huge chunks of Europe were connected to huge chunks of Asia were connected to Europe through this unified Mongol Empire, and exposure to goods increased dramatically. And we have the explorations, the travels of a few Europeans, individuals such as Marco Polo, who traveled all the way from Venice to China, learned about that empire, and came back with all kinds of stories of the wealth of the Mongol Empire and the Chinese. Gets the Europeans even more interested in maintaining this trade and in having access to these goods when they hear about that wealth. In particular, Europeans are fascinated in the luxury trade. We've discussed this before, the idea that trade was so expensive and the moving of goods was so expensive that luxuries were the predominant good that was transferred. So we're talking spices, silk, have come into our story before. So Europeans want more and more access to these types of luxuries, and the Mongol Empire had helped them to really get a taste for it. Now, as we know, the Mongol Empire did not last forever, and we have the Ming Chinese coming into play. in particular the Admiral Zheng He. Was while the Ming were interested in world exploration at the very beginning of that dynasty, and Zheng He has his fleet, that the world gets even more exposure to Chinese goods. He's sailing around the world, and on his hundreds of ships during his 7 voyages, he's expanding knowledge of Chinese goods and knowledge of the tremendous wealth of the Chinese empire. And again, this is fueling the fire of desire for Chinese goods. And as we can see, he's visiting huge chunks of this Indian Ocean world. So every port city along Zheng He's voyages are now getting direct contact with the Chinese and seeing for themselves the wealth and the luxury of Chinese society. And this is going to make people desire it. And it was a tremendous opportunity for the Chinese themselves. But as we discovered in the past, China is going to discontinue these large trade expeditions because as China went out, they discovered that the rest of the world simply didn't have as many goods as China did. China was so wealthy that everybody else was poor by comparison, and the Chinese they didn't profit enough from this engagement in the rest of the world. And so the Ming dynasty loses interest. They get distracted by some other things that are going on, and the Chinese withdraw from this global trade network. You can still get Chinese goods, but you've got to go to China to get them. The people who are interested in going to China are the Arab merchants. This is Arabia right here, but as the Islamic Empire expanded and pushed both east and west, Arabs come in contact with the rest of the world, and they discover all these goods, and they want access to it. And for the first time, they can really afford it. And Arab merchants are spreading out into the Indian Ocean, and they're sailing around the Indian subcontinent, always close to shore. Trade and travel was close to shore at this time in world history, but they are trying to get access to all these trade goods, particularly in India and going into China. And they're having a lot of success doing this, especially once Zheng He's fleets disappear from the Indian Ocean. When the Chinese disappear, that leaves a power vacuum that Arab merchants are thrilled to step into. And throughout the late Middle Ages, it will be the Arab merchants who really have control of the region, including the port cities where the most important trade is happening. Arab merchants move into those Indian port cities. They don't necessarily conquer regions or conquer cities, but they have so much influence and so much power that anybody who's in charge of a city, like Calicut, they have to pay attention to what the Arab merchants want. They control the wealth, so they have power. And with that power, they grow to control the trade and have a monopoly on trade, and grow tremendously wealthy. And they're going to want to hold on to that. And that's going to be a part of the story coming up. But that is all for today's review lesson. When we next meet, we're going to be looking at how this itch for trade and this age of exploration gets going and starts to look at how they can get to China. Thank you, and that's all. I'll see you next time.